Greetings, dear listener. Subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new scary stories and support me with a like. Enjoy listening.
It was about 2 a.m. and I knew this town had a reputation for shady people. I was coming home from visiting family on the other side of the state. I first noticed the headlights behind me just outside of town. I thought it might have been the local police department, so I slowed down a bit because I didn't want to give them a reason to pull me at 2 a.m. The vehicle slowed with me but stayed behind me. I guessed it had to be a police officer. I also knew I was getting tired and needed some caffeine. Seeing an open gas station ahead, I decided to swing in and grab a drink. When I pulled in, so did the other vehicle. Looking in my rear view mirror, I saw it definitely was not a police cruiser. The car did not go to the pumps or to the store itself, but hung back trying to stay out of the streetlights. I made a decision to not get out and verify whether I was being followed. I turned out of the parking lot and back onto the highway. Looking in the mirror, I saw the same car get back on the road with me. I did not have a cell phone at the time, so there was no calling for help, nor was I about to let this continue. I had to act fast and planned on turning the tables on whoever was in the car following me. I knew there was a Walmart not far up the road and they have a well-lit parking lot with cameras. I turned in and continued to drive normally. The other car continued to follow me. That's when I made my move. I dumped my truck into second gear and gunned it to create space. Turned into the parking area away from any other cars and dropped into first gear. I then applied the brake while turning the wheel and sliding across the pavement. Opening my door and stepping out of the truck while it was still moving, I knew the engine would shut off once the truck was moving too slow. I drew my firearm and moved towards the other vehicle, aiming for the driver and shouting at them. They sped out of the parking lot and drove off as fast as they could, and I finished my trip. I guess they thought 3-on-1 in the middle of the night was going to be an easy target. Unfortunately, their target was me, a combat veteran who works in law enforcement. I was in the USAF stationed in Omaha in the late 80s. At the time, I hung with my roommate and another friend. My name is Tracy. My roommate's name was Tracy. The girl we hung out with name was Stacy. When we were together, everyone always thought we were lying and being the silly teenagers we were. We always found it funny. One weekend, we decided to take a road trip to Kansas City, Missouri. We were speeding down the highway, laughing and singing at the top of our lungs. We were happy and having the time of our lives. Stacy was driving and she had a bit of a lead foot and must have been going too fast because before long, a state trooper pulled up behind us and turned on his lights. Stacy immediately pulled over. By the time the officer made it to her window, she had already had her license and registration in hand and the window down. The officer looked at her and then looked at me and Tracy. Then he said, "I want you to follow me. Don't try to run off or you all will be going to jail." He then went and got back in his car. Needless to say, the three of us were puzzled and talking amongst ourselves, wondering why he just didn't take Stacy's identification and write her a ticket. The officer pulled out slowly and we dropped in behind him and followed him down the road. He drove a few miles, then exited the highway. He drove a little ways and turned onto a dirt road that was surrounded by stalks of corn. We all stopped talking as we became more alarmed. However, being young, scared, and since he was a police officer, we continued to follow him. The officer drove for some time down this dirt road and then pulled into an area that had a big beat-up old barn. As he stopped and we stopped behind him, a group of men with shotguns exited the barn. It wasn't until that point did we realize we were in mortal danger and panic set in. The officer walked back to our car and told Stacy to get out and follow him to his car. As she got out, she looked at me and Tracy, and there was sheer terror on her face. She followed him to his car, and he motioned her to get in on the passenger side. She did. Tracy and I were crying, and as the armed men stood on the side of the car looking at us, we began quietly praying for God to protect the three of us. We prayed that Stacy wasn't being hurt and somehow they would let us leave. After some minutes, Stacy bolted out of the officer's car and ran back to the car and jumped in the driver's seat. She was crying hysterically. So of course Tracy and I began crying harder. The officer got out of his car and walked back to our car, this time to Tracy's window as she was in the front passenger seat. He asked, "Is it true all y'all are in the Air Force?" To which Tracy replied, "Yes, sir." The officer calmly said, "Get out of here and go back to where y'all came from. I better not see y'all again." As soon as he finished, Stacy turned on the car, whipped it around, and sped back down the dirt road. She somehow navigated back to the highway. As she drove back toward the base, the silence was only broken by an occasional sob from one of us. Stacy drove for a while, and as soon as we crossed back over into Nebraska, she pulled over on the side of the highway. Then she began to sob heavily. Tracy and I hugged her and asked if she was hurt in any way. She shook her head no. She wasn't hurt. After she calmed down enough, she told us what happened in the police car. After she got in the car, she offered the officer her identification and told him she was sorry for speeding. He took her information and then asked her, "What are you doing with those two N-words?" Stacy was white. She explained that we were on a road trip. He then told her that if she would do certain favors for him, he might let us go with a warning. At that, Stacy had a complete meltdown. I guess while he was waiting for her to calm down, he finally looked at her identification and saw that she also had given him her military ID. He asked her if we all were in the military, and between sobs she said we were. He asked where we were stationed, and she told him Offutt AFB. He then told her to go back to her car. As we sat there after Stacy told us what occurred, I think it hit all three of us at the same time that the only thing that saved us was that we were in the military and stationed at a nearby base. We hugged each other and cried until we could not cry anymore. We didn't report what had happened. Again, we were teenagers and didn't think we would be believed over a law enforcement officer. We never talked about it after that day. That incident has haunted me for years, all of the what ifs. But as I have gotten older, what haunts me more is the thought that others may not have been as lucky as we were. July of 2014. I was en route home after a 2-week vacation. I was alone towing a fifth-wheel camper with my pickup truck. It was about 10:30 on a Saturday night, and I was about 2 hours from home and was planning on making it home yet that night. I was in a stretch of 2-lane road in Wisconsin that has very few houses and a 30-mile-long road. It is wooded on both sides with shallow, sloping ditches that are mowed by the county. It is fenced at the tree line. There is only one combination: bar, restaurant, motel, campground through this whole barren road. I was already driving a little under the speed limit as deer were out a lot that night. I saw movement up ahead on the right shoulder, and assuming it to be more deer, I slowed way down. As I passed, I saw it was a woman. She was tall, lean, long brunette hair, wearing a white crop top shirt, blue plaid pleated skirt, and knee-high stockings. Honestly, looked like a Halloween outfit. Walking with the traffic, so I saw her from behind, just off of the shoulder in the short grass. I immediately assumed car breakdown or fight with SO and had been put out, as she was miles from any house or business. I pulled over to a stop, hit the flashers, took a flashlight, and went to see if she was all right. When I got to the rear of the camper, there was no one there. She could not have made it through the ditch, over the fence, and into the woods in the time it took me to get to the rear of the camper. I was far enough ahead that she could not have made it to the rear of the camper before me. I walked back to where she had been, and I saw no sign that the heavy dew in the grass had been disturbed. She had just vanished into thin air without a trace she had ever been there. I made the rest of the trip home with the hair in my neck standing on end. I wish I had a dash cam back then. One day I was driving to New York with my mom and my grandma. We were about 30 minutes away from home, just about to enter the highway. When we left, it was around 11:30 a.m. Anyways, we were driving, and all of a sudden we get a flat tire and pull over to the side of the road, and we called a pickup truck and waited, and nothing came. then another and another and another until around 4 hours had passed. Then we were called by the pickup truck company and we got exited that they would say that they're almost there, but when they called, they said that they got a flat tire. Then after waiting for about another 4 hours had passed, so it was just waiting. The real reason this was scary, whenever me and my mom and I would complain, we would get lectured by Grandma to be patient. I have one I have told before to some close PTPL of mine. I used to deliver pizza, and one night I was at a stoplight next to a van that looked like a U-Haul or something, and I saw this girl stick her head out the front seat crying, struggling to get out. I was shocked. I also heard PPL in the back, so I called 911 and I followed the van at a distance, but then he screeched in the middle of the road while I was talking to the operator and he got out asking me why I was following. Terrified, I sped off. I tried to describe where I last saw them. The rest of the night I kept thinking this guy was going to try ordering pizza and ambush me. It was one of the most terrifying nights I have ever experienced. My company used to have another office in another state that was 2 states over. Most of the time I flew there, but sometimes we would have equipment or vehicles that needed to be delivered. On those cases, I volunteered to make the trip and would stay at the other office for a week at a time. Sometimes I would take a rest stop at a motel, and sometimes I would break up the drive by pulling over to a rest stop and sleeping in the back of the vehicle for a bit. One time I was driving a big box truck, like a big truck you would rent at U-Haul. We bought the truck, it was used, and the back of the truck was filled with equipment and stuff from that office. I offered to make the trip. Unfortunately, the morning I was scheduled to take off there was a delay, something I needed to take in that truck. I think it was a big copier machine. It didn't arrive till almost 3 p.m. After loading it in the truck and getting ready to take off, I knew I was going to hit rush hour traffic, so I opted to delay my leave for 2 hours so it would be after 5. And even though there was still lots of traffic, it would only be local in the vicinity. And once I got out in the open, it was pretty much a straight shot till I reached state line. Having to pull over a couple times to fuel and restroom brakes, I got into a rural area north of my state after midnight. I pulled over one last time that night for fuel and coffee. The next stretch was going to be very dark and desolate, so I was preparing myself. I knew there was a last stop rest stop near the border, so I pulled over there to use the restroom, stretch my legs, and maybe rest a few minutes before moving on. So I pull up to the rest stop and it's empty. It is somewhat well lit, and I was in pretty good shape, so I wasn't worried too much about my safety as I used to box. I go to the restroom and wash up a bit, but when I make it back to my truck and there is a pickup truck next to my truck and a guy is standing next to my truck, he starts to make small talk. Then he asks me if I was having any mechanical problems with my truck. I thought that was odd, as why would that be a question? I get back in my truck and take off. After this point, there is a long stretch that is mostly forest-like area, kind of creepy, driving through at 3 a.m. There is a bridge up ahead, a long bridge that, having driven this route before, I know that under that is like a gorge in water. All of a sudden, all my lights in the truck turn off. Headlights, instrument lights, even the running lights. I tap on the brakes and look behind me. Even the brake lights seem to be out. Thankfully, it was a moonlit night enough to me to gauge what was ahead of me. I was sort of more angry than panicked, so I slam my fist on the dashboard and yell something like, "Damn truck." It was a Fonz move because suddenly everything came back up again. I drove looking for somewhere to stop, like a gas station, motel, shopping center, something, but nothing was in sight. I remembered a gas station I had stopped at another time, which was a city about 10 more miles up the road. I make it to that gas station and notice that shortly after I pulled in that same pickup truck with that guy pulled over. Now he wasn't pulling up to the pumps, but I suddenly got this chill, like, did this MF do something to my truck? I started to put some fuel in the truck, thinking about my next move. Then just as I was about to get back in my truck and try to make it on, a cop car pulls into the station and I wave at it and get out. I make some small talk to the cop and point back in the direction of the street where that pickup truck was pulled over. After I do that, he drives off. I think I asked the police about the road conditions and asked them if there is a motel or something ahead. When I get back in my truck, I decide that if that guy did do something that might disable my truck, I better pull off for the night. I kept looking behind me to see if the truck was following me, I think it was, but couldn't be sure. I make it to another town a bit larger than the one that I had left, and there was a motel. I find a motel that was next to another gas station and check in. I lock up my truck, grab my bag, and keep looking around me like expecting something to pop out. I get into my room and try to sleep, but kept looking out my window. I only slept a few minutes at a time then. By full daybreak, I check out, eat breakfast, and head back on the road. I eventually make it to my office and ask them to have the truck looked at by a mechanic. I told them the issue. They reported back to me after I was back home that the mechanic found nothing wrong, and they never experienced the same issue. I've driven back and forth across the country a few times now and lived out of my car for a few months while on a trail crew. My biggest issues have always been with car trouble. Luckily, it's always been in spots where I have cell service and have been able to drive to or be towed to a mechanic. Have a loose plan if something like that were to happen. Sometimes it was a quick fix and was done in a couple of hours. Other times I had to wait a few days. Sometimes you're in a small town and the mechanic is closed on weekends. Sometimes a part has to be ordered, etc. Will you be able to stay in a hotel if needed? Do you have AAA? I'm not sure how things will look over the summer in terms of COVID, but just having an idea of what you'd do if you needed a safe spot to hang out if your car needed repair work might be helpful. And keep jumper cables in your car. Traveling and camping alone as a woman has been very liberating for me, and I hope it will be for you as well. But definitely, I've been made to feel uncomfortable at times, restrooms after dark especially. Overall, I've found people to be kind and respectful, but do whatever feels good for you in terms of safety. When I first started camping, I would lay awake all night listening for every little sound, and, to me at least, the smallest sound at night sounds like something scary. Once I got used to it, I was able to sleep better. I usually listen to quiet music in one ear so I can still hear something if I need to, but am able to not focus on every single sound. But doing whatever you can to have a sound peace of mind at night is helpful. I usually would just sleep with my car keys within reach so I could at least set off my car alarm. Not sure if that really did much for me in terms of safety, but just helped me feel a little better. With a smartphone, I never thought I'd really use a physical map, but having an atlas can be really helpful. Look out for BLM land or national forests. You can often find free places to camp. There's lots of apps like Park Advisor, iOverlander, and the Dirt you can use to find campsites. HipCamp is also kind of like Airbnb, but for camping. I regret having so much stuff in my car and having it so disorganized. If you can, keep yourself organized and get a bag or box for the roof of your car so you can have room to sleep in your car if needed. Setting up a tent in the dark when you're exhausted from driving can be a bummer. In terms of keeping clean, I've been able to find free or cheap showers at public pools or beaches. Some are nicer than others, but it gets the job done. And when all else fails, there's always the trusty baby wipe shower. Overall, trust yourself and use your common sense. If a situation doesn't feel good or is something you're not prepared for, head out. You're strong and capable and will learn as you go. Be aware of the wildlife, landscape, and weather wherever you're camping or hiking, and make sure to keep an eye out for things like fire restrictions. Doing some brief research about wherever you're heading to can help to feel more comfortable and confident in staying there. Do you have a dog? Preferably a big dog. I'm a woman who solo camps a lot, albeit in a tent. I always bring my German Shepherd with me and keep her in plain sight. Even people just saying hello keep their distance. On trails, people completely stop and wait for us to pass. Be smart and trust your gut. I've never used the 2 chairs idea, but to add to it, I've heard of some women bringing an extra pair of men's boots. I personally don't bring a gun because I am not comfortable around guns. I'd suggest not bringing a weapon you're not comfortable using. If you don't know what you're doing with X weapon, someone could easily take it from you. Sleep with the back of your tent car to what area scares you the most. I heard this in a YouTube video and it helps. Before you go to bed, spend some time familiarizing yourself with the sounds around you and mentally identify them. It'll cut down your fear. Most importantly, have fun. No horror stories to report here. Expect things to go wrong and lean into that part of your journey. Several years ago, my friends and I were going to a church camp late November twilight. We knew the road only from the descriptions of our friend. At the very end of the road, we accidentally turned the wrong way, but we didn't realize it right away. The road led into a deep forest, and we were sure that our tent camp should have been located in this place. After some time, we drove past a huge stone gate with wrought iron doors. They resembled the entrance to a cemetery, but beyond the gate there were no paths, only dark forest. There was no fence either, just a huge stone gate. We didn't think much of it, although the place was strange, and continued on our way. The fog was thickening. We entered some village, and then the most inexplicable thing began. At first glance, the first house on our way was the most ordinary. But then we noticed that there was a car standing next to him with hazard lights on. All the doors were open. There was no one in the car or near it. The lights in the house were turned off. We slowed down to see if something had happened, but then my friend pointed ahead. All the houses on both sides of the road looked exactly the same. Dark houses, all cars on emergency lights and with open doors. We didn't see a single person around. It all looked like some kind of very strange prank. We continued driving along the same road to get out of this place as quickly as possible. Suddenly, a huge black dog, similar to a German shepherd, jumped out from around the bend. She ran after us at full speed and barked loudly. After that, our driver turned sharply and rushed away from this village. We never returned there again. Later, I tried to understand where we turned and find this place on the map, but nothing came of it. Even on the satellite view, I couldn't find this road. Was driving from Atlanta, GA to Lexington, SC with my GF to visit my parents. I like to drive at night since there are less people on the road and I can take my time. At around 3 a.m. or so, we are making good time. I had stopped at a gas station and picked up some coffee for us, and we were due in about an hour. GF was sleeping soundly and I'm listening to a quiet radio humming away. I start getting a little drowsy and take a sip. Road was just as my coffee, no cars in sight except for a spotted few on the side of the road here and there. In the distance I can make out what looks like a hitchhiker, or what I think is one, but can't really tell due to such low light. As I get closer, I start to notice other things, like how the person is kinda thin and tall and completely, for the most part, apparently brown. I'm right up on this thing now, and at about 20 feet it turns around and locks eyes with me as I pass by. This was no person, and it is the most terrifying thing I have ever seen in my life. It was a deer, or I tell myself it was. I have seen deer stand on their hind legs to fight, but they still have deer posture when they do. Not only that, but I was watching this thing walk for about 30 seconds from first seeing it in the distance to passing it. The posture it had was human. Standard biped stance, arms back, chin down, but the worst part was the eyes, or lack thereof. In their place were two large black pits, almost black hole-ish. I'll never forget the stare down it gave me. The instant I passed it, I had the only panic attack I've ever had in my life. I had to wake up my girlfriend to keep calm enough to get to an exit with a large gas station a few miles away. Like hell, I was going off a ramp close to that thing. After we pulled into the station, I had a complete meltdown. I started crying harder than I ever thought I could. I couldn't talk, breath, or do anything but want to curl into a ball and cry. After around 30 minutes or so, she finally gets me to calm down enough to tell her what happened. While I don't think she believed what I think I saw, she knew that I was convinced and legitimately scared to death. Every once in a blue moon, I will dream about it and wake up crying or in a cold sweat, and she will tease me about it or roll over and ignore me instead of comforting me about the one thing that I've ever been terrified of. But I know what I saw, and I know it will haunt me for the rest of my life. A lot of people that drive for a living or have done balls-to-the-wall cross-country drives can tell you about the running shadows. First time I saw them, I was on the tail end of 12 straight hours of driving. I was driving through the middle of nowhere in the desert at night. Very little light from the sky, no man-made lights even on the horizon. Just the pitiful cone from my truck's headlamp, and being in the middle of the desert, it pretty much only lights up the road ahead. Nothing above ground level to catch the light. As I'm barreling along, I start to see shadowy figures running alongside my truck out of the corners of my eyes, on 2 legs and 4. All I can think about is the creepy stories you read online about shit that lives out in the desert, or the Asian ghost stories where if you don't acknowledge the spirit, it can't harm you. So I've got my eyes glued to the road, refusing to let them flicker off to the side. I rolled my windows up and cranked up the volume on my radio. Drove like that for probably an hour and a half until they slowly petered out roughly 15 minutes outside of a little one-light town. I've had people try to carjack me. People try to rob me after I pull over to render aid. People jump out at me on Twisty Mountain Road, you name it. But nothing matching that level of fear the first time I saw them. Felt like my spine was rippling like a ribbon in a wind trying to jump clear out of my back and hide under the seat. Sleep deprivation mixed with sensory deprivation does some strange things. This is the only experience I have ever had like this. Nothing else has come close. Some friends and I, 5 of us, were driving around some rural roads waiting for a friend to arrive to his girlfriend's house. We were just kind of wasting time, cruising down some dirt roads around 20 miles an hour, talking. My friend who is driving slams on his brakes, and I, in the passenger seat, looked up, and there was this thing. I had never seen anything like it before. We stopped the car and watched as this thing, which didn't have a perceivable head, moved slowly across the road about 15 feet in front of us. It was creepy to say the least. It was approximately 4 feet tall, and we could see its joints moving as it walked slowly with a gait similar to a giraffe. It had very skinny, long legs. Its body was about 1.5 feet round. If it had hair, it was pretty short, but the thing was brown. We were all screaming, "What the fuck is that?" We could not see any perceivable head, and it was walking perpendicular to us. We watched as it slowly walked through these people's yard and behind their house. Needless to say, we were freaking out about it. When we got to my friend's house, we all drew pictures of it separately and showed each other at the same time when we were done to verify that we all saw what we saw. It was the strangest thing I have ever seen, and I have not found any satisfactory explanation to this day, 20 years later.